Welcome back to the Corporate Secretary Forum US 2020. Really pleased to have you join our next session, which is entitled What Next for the AGM? This is a really exciting lesson. Some of the points that we're going to focus on are looking back at the 2020 proxy season, understanding some of the lessons that were learned, particularly for first-time virtual AGMs, trying to cover what the best governance practices are for when you're hosting a virtual AGM, potentially looking at will companies revert to in-person meetings next year, and finally understanding how virtual AGMs have been affected under the lockdown and what sort of impact that has had on investor sentiment and voting. I don't have any of the answers, but I'm extremely pleased to be joined by three people who can give us some insight. Firstly, we've got Courtney Camlett, who is the Vice President, Associate General Counsel and Corporate Secretary at Vontier. Rosemarie Glazer, the Senior Vice President, Corporate Secretary, Deputy General Counsel from AIG, and Edith Nipper, who is the Corporate Secretary at South Jersey Industries. So thank you, all of you, for joining us. Could you just take 1 or 2 minutes to just give a quick introduction to yourself and your background, starting with yourself, Rosemarie?
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you for Corporate Secretary for putting this together. I have been practicing a little over 30 years. I started my career at Jones Day, and I've made a number of stops with in-house companies such as American Airlines, Telvista, recently Siemens, and then I've been with AIG 3.5 years. In my role here, I oversee not only board and corporate governance, but also SEC disclosures, capital markets, M&A transactions, and real estate.
Brilliant, that's fantastic, thank you. And Courtney, over to yourself as well. Can you give us a quick bit of background?
Sure, absolutely. I have been practicing securities and governance for about 20 years. I started my career at the Securities and Exchange Commission and went to a couple law firms from there, and I've been at various companies in-house. I joined Vontier about a year ago to help stand it up and help it be a public company. We spun off from our parent in October. So it's been a lot of fun and a lot of work. And my responsibility is not just for the board and SEC reporting, but also for our risk and insurance and helping to stand up our ESG program.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And last but not least, Edith, can you give us a quick couple of minutes about your background as well?
Sure. I've also been out for about 20 years. I don't have any law firm experience. I've always been in-house, and I've worked in a number of industries, telecom, credit card processing, and energy. I have many years in energy. And I'm corporate secretary in this position. In prior positions, I've worked with the SEC compliance as well, but in this role, I'm focused on corporate secretary, board, shareholders, and pulling all of that together.
Brilliant, that's fantastic, thank you. So really keen to get into the discussion. Just to sort of set the table, really, it'd be quite interesting just to get a bit of interest into what your experience has been around virtual AGMs this year and the reasons behind hosting those virtual AGMs. So Rosemarie, if I can start with you. Now, AIG actually made the decision to host a virtual AGM this year before you published your proxy statement. Can you quickly just give us a bit of just talk us through your reasoning to pivot to virtual so quickly and some of the challenges or benefits that were associated with that decision?
Absolutely, Steve. A lot of credit goes to my team, who were very proactive and forward-thinking throughout this process. We were scheduled to file our preliminary proxy on March 13th, and that date's important because our company announced remote working on March 11th. And we are based in New York, which was the epicenter initially in the country of coronavirus, and began shutting down well before many other areas of the country. And so we didn't have a lot of precedent about what to do, how to do it. Our initial thought was, well, we don't know how long we're going to be in this situation. And so for our preliminary proxy, which we were filing, we quickly put in optionality. So in our preliminary proxy, we said it may be physical meeting, it may be a hybrid meeting, it may be a virtual meeting, but we put all three in just to hedge our bets and buy ourselves some time to think about the issue and see if we could get any advice, particularly from our outside counsel. When we got to March 26th, we were 4 days from filing our definitive proxy, and we really needed to make a decision. There were consequences. If we went out with still that optionality and not a final meeting location, we were probably going to have to file, not probably, we would have needed to remail, potentially under Delaware law, because again, no decisions had come out or guidance, a new notice to shareholders of the meeting location. And we would have needed to issue a press release indicating that we had a location change and to file additional soliciting material. We thought it would be better if we could make a decision once and for all. Just, you know, we have a saying, fish or cut bait. We just needed to decide, and we thought it would be better for us, and knowing the way that our technology works, that we needed to make a decision early. And I was very fortunate. I have a very supportive board. We went to them with a memo that basically outlined the pros and cons of a virtual meeting versus a physical meeting, and what the unknowns were, such as we might have meeting restrictions that would not permit us to do a physical meeting based on what we were hearing at that time from the government officials. We had ruled out a hybrid because we thought we're either going to be in person, which is what AIG has typically done, or we're not. And to do something in the middle just seemed like the worst of both worlds, not the best. And the board was very supportive. We went out with a UWC, a unanimous written consent, and they approved immediately that we could pivot to a virtual session. We had already talked to Broadridge as a provider. They were also not just the platform for the virtual meeting, they were also helping us with the distribution of our materials, which helped to have kind of a one-stop shop. And we, immediately had to make some changes to the proxy before we filed it to indicate that we had pivoted to this virtual format. But I'm very glad in retrospect. At the time, it was a scary thing to do because we were just guessing, right? That in May, and no one could conceive that in May we would still all be remote working. And here we are 7 months later, we're still remote working. But at the time, we thought this was a few weeks, maybe 2 months. But I'm glad we made the decision we did. It made everything much easier. There were still a lot of questions, and I'm sure we're going to talk about those later in the session, that needed to be answered, but we had direction and we knew what we were going to do, and we were able to marshal our resources accordingly. It was a gamble that paid off.
Fantastic. No, I think that's great, and really, good to kind of hear about just giving your stakeholders certainty, whether it, one decision or another would have been better, not trying to be in the middle of the two, but really just say, this is our decision and let's go for it full on. So it's a really admirable, and I'm sure something that lots of people can learn from as well. Courtney, just to turn to you, I know in your introduction, you mentioned that, as a new public company following a spin-off, this is an extremely interesting time to be holding a virtual AGM. So you didn't have an AGM this year for Vontier, but have had experiences with virtual meetings previously. So can you tell us a little bit about those virtual meetings and what is it that you can share about your experiences?
Absolutely. So at a prior company, we actually decided to have a virtual meeting for the first time in 2019. We needed a little bit of optionality as to location during the board meeting. So we tried that route, and we also had a very supportive board. And it turned out to be a great tool. Usually we didn't have any shareholders attend the annual meeting, and we had a significantly greater number join online. And, we were prepared for things like questions, and we had done practice runs with directors. But it turned out to be a great format, and we had some good participation. And that company, I left, but they did another virtual annual meeting this year, like most. And when we were in the process of the spin, our parent company did something similar in terms of filing the proxy with optionality. And then they filed an amendment to say they were doing a virtual meeting, which was the first time they had done one. So I think, there was a lot of scramble for companies in 2020 that won't be the case next year. The process will be smoother for everybody, and I think it gets better as the platforms progress and there are additional options. But I think overall, it was a good experience.
Brilliant. No, that's fantastic. Thank you for that. And just to turn to yourself as well, Edith, South Jersey Industries, you held 2 prior virtual shareholder meetings. So it'd be really interesting to hear about those shareholder meetings. And having not just done 1, but 2, hugely experienced in this world. So did that mean that this was relatively straightforward for you? Or were there knock-on effects as a result of the massive adoption of virtual AGMs across the board?
Well, we did have 2 virtual shareholder meetings this year, and the first was the annual meeting, and then we went out with the special shareholder meeting, and both went smoothly, and our experience was very similar to Rosemarie's, and especially with the annual, that the analysis and the pivoting at the last minute and setting everything up so that we would have the option to pivot if necessary.
Brilliant. No, that's great. And just one other question. I mean, South Jersey Industries are obviously based in New Jersey. And so your company was reliant on the emergency order from the state allowing virtual AGMs. Could you, for the benefit of the audience, can you briefly talk us through the timeline of when the order was passed, when you made the decision to host a virtual AGM, and then when you published your proxy statement?
Yes, sure. So again, our analysis was very similar to Rosemarie's, except that we filed our definitive on March 13th. So at that time, everything was very, very murky as to what was happening because the lockdown orders were being published. We actually had the March 13th was a Friday, and we started working from home on that following Monday. And so we were faced with, what we were going to do, especially in light of in New Jersey, 100% virtual shareholder meetings are not permitted. And it was very early in the lockdown from the coronavirus, and an emergency order had not been issued, and we didn't know what was going to happen. And so when we filed, we put a statement in there basically including all of the information for a online meeting and reserving the right to convert to 100% virtual, keeping in mind that, it just seemed logical that they were going to have to issue some sort of exception because, otherwise how were we going to proceed with the proxy season? So in fact, that is what happened. And it happened a couple of weeks after we filed. And the SEC also published some exemptions from their normal requirements of the follow-on mailings, et cetera. And we just had to, do the press release. So we had everything set up. And so we pivoted. We issued the press release. We had the board approve the conversion of the meeting to 100% virtual via unanimous written consent. But we really were sort of flying blind, so to speak, when we filed it, because we didn't know that the state would issue that order, but they did ultimately do that. And then we had a special shareholder meeting in October. And again, you know, people are permitted to interact with one another, but we really liked that 100% virtual experience. So we sort of took the same approach of, filing as a hybrid, but ultimately converting to the 100% virtual, with the hopes that the governor would extend that emergency order, which he ultimately did.
Fantastic. No, that sounds great. A lot of bravery during these times, but well thought through and sort of preparing for the different eventualities, which is great. So now that you've sort of taken your decision to host a virtual AGM, I'm really curious to get into some of the lessons that you learned as well. The first thing is around technology, and in particular, relating that to your board. So Rosemarie, if I can come back to you again, how did you go about getting your directors comfortable with the technology? And did you take any decisions around whether it should be on video, audio only? How did you sort of manage that aspect of it?
The technology challenges, particularly with large boards, should never be underestimated. We had not at the time yet even done a virtual board meeting. So this was going to be a challenge on multiple levels. I love my board. They are, incredibly intelligent professionals. They are not the most technology proficient group I've met. So we were extremely concerned about the fact that I wasn't going to have them all in the same room. I didn't have control necessarily over the equipment they were using. And truthfully, they were very nervous about how this was all going to work. So we did two things. We did a dry run, just my team and I, on the tool so that we ourselves felt comfortable. And then we did a dry run with the directors. And we did not make it part of the rehearsal. We did a separate dry run that was just technology oriented so that they wouldn't confuse and have too many things to think about. The other thing we did is we put in place a backup plan. And our backup plan is we also had the directors dial in to WebEx. And so what we did is we had them on their iPads have WebEx in front of them. It was on silent, but it allowed us to see each other. And literally my team and I, we had signs made up. And so that we could give, we could hold up signs, your mic is, you're on mute, or, questions coming, it's going to you, or, there are X people, on the line, whatever it was. But we had pre-made signs, and then I literally had one person, her only job was to make signs. But it gave them kind of a comfort level, right? Because there was a visual connection. So they could kind of, see what was going on. It gave them a bit of a safety net. I had incredible support, both from Broadridge, who was our vendor, but also my internal IT team. We actually did all come together. The group running the meeting, we were all in one conference room, socially distanced, appropriate PPE. The directors were all virtual, but we were able to, kind of put them around the room as if we knew, where they were sitting so that we could kind of connect with them. And that rehearsal was, I think, very reassuring to our directors. We chose to do audio only because I didn't want to try and also inject video into the process. I was worried about too many things happening at once. And so I didn't want them to have the WebEx camera and then confuse that with the cameras that would be used to project them to the audience. I thought it would just be safer to go audio only. I think that was also a good call for our group. But those were some of the things that we did to try and overcome kind of that initial nervous Nelly-ness. Everybody had a backup landline as well as a backup cell phone. We had 2 iPads issued to everyone. We also had their laptop computers. So, I mean, we had redundancy to redundancy plus a redundancy, just to make sure that we knew we had everything covered. We taught them how to hotspot, from their phones in case they lost their, internet access. I mean, you name it. We had an entire protocol document. But the planning paid off. We didn't need any of that, but it made everyone feel better that we were going to get it done and that it would be seamless. And truthfully, for the directors, they wanted it to be professional, right? This is their image. This is their chance to speak to the shareholders. And it was very important for them that this came off as if the company knew what it was doing. It was handling the crisis. To them, it was a bit of a PR event to reassure everyone that it was business as usual at AIG. And fortunately, we were able to deliver that experience.
That's fantastic. I absolutely love the idea of what is quite a low-tech solution of having those cards to hold up. So I'm sure everyone watching will be scribbling down notes and putting that in. And as you say, practice makes perfect. Having that backup connectivity, sort of Wi-Fi hotspot, and lots of really fantastic points there. Edith, if I can just kind of pass that to you. I mean, obviously you'd have gone through practices and dry runs as well. From a technology standpoint, what were some of the things that you learned, that you prepared for? If there was a checklist of things that could go wrong, what did you sort of cover?
So we did not have all of the redundancy that Rosemary planned for, and fortunately everything went well. And I was thinking, boy, that's belts and suspenders. We should have done that. But we have a great IT group, and we did go through all of the rehearsals, and we did our best to make sure everyone felt comfortable. And, we had the call with Broadridge in advance, in which we sort of went through a rehearsal with them, because we felt we were at their mercy, because we were using a platform that we weren't controlling, and we want it to be familiar. And our investor relations group and our shareholder services group were involved, and they were the ones who were in charge of monitoring the questions coming in, and the number of folks on the line, and we had a separate chat going in Teams, and that's how because we were not in the same room with one another. So we had 2 platforms running. We had the Broadridge platform, and then we had set up a chat room in Teams to be able to communicate with one another behind the scenes, to handle and field any issues, questions, etc. But we definitely rehearsed to get everyone comfortable. We did audio, because at the time Broadridge was not offering a video option. What they offered was they wanted I'm sorry, I don't know. I feel like I'm in the presidential debate or vice presidential debate. Right. At any rate, they did not have video available like we're the format we're using now. What they offered was basically we had to hire a camera crew for $30,000 or $40,000, which we weren't willing to invest in. However, I have sat in on some of the Broadridge webinars they have, and I think they're working on it, and stay tuned. Maybe that will be an option for our coming annual meeting.
Fantastic. No, that's great. And just to pick up on one of your points, I think it shows just how important those relationships that you have in the company, particularly with IT teams and that sort of stuff. They seem to be the superheroes that come in and help you out when you really need it. which is fantastic. Courtney, I don't know if you have anything to add to that in terms of how you made directors comfortable with technology. But in addition to that, I'm interested to hear around this ongoing challenge of being able to, build rapport between your directors and your shareholders in this virtual setting. So have you done anything around that to be able to make sure that people can connect with your stakeholders as, managers of a new company and directors of a new company?
Yeah, I mean, we utilize Teams a lot. So there's face-to-face-ish type meetings. I will say I was one of the ones scribbling down Rosemarie's WebEx suggestion, because that is a great idea and a good data point for keeping it audio so that you have that video component internally. But sorry, I digress. But as far as, getting the board and stakeholders together, it's just been a bunch of virtual meetings. And honestly, with people not traveling, I think there's been a lot more availability and ease of getting people together and connected. So it's definitely been a challenge standing up a new company and a new board in a virtual environment. But I think, we've done this now for long enough that people are getting used to it.
That's great. And Rosemarie, to come back to you as well. So virtual meetings are more accessible, and just to build on that point around building rapport with those shareholders, did you see new audiences come in, and what did you do to sort of build rapport between your directors and those shareholders in this virtual setting?
So we did actually see pretty significant increase in attendance, and we've always webcast our meetings, but people to attend physically, you needed to be a shareholder to be able to be in the room. And we saw in 2019, our attendance was 121, and that included, all the officers and employees. I think it was a total of maybe 6, non-employee shareholders in the room. This go round with the virtual meeting, we had an attendance of over 200 people. As part of the meeting, we didn't have the ability to break it down quite as easily as we could in a physical meeting, but clearly we had greater attendance. And, again, as I mentioned, for our directors and for our CEO and our chair, for them, they take the shareholder meeting very seriously. For them, it is a connection point with one of, our most important stakeholders, and it's their opportunity to engage directly. We do, off-season engagement with our investors, like Courtney was describing, but this is different, right? This is for those shareholders that maybe don't have the advantage of being able to have, one-on-one meetings because their holdings might not be as significant. And one of the things that I recall is there was a debate about the questions. Right? We did extra prep because we anticipated we would have more questions because we anticipated we'd have more shareholders present. And it would be easier for them to ask their questions because they wouldn't have to queue for the mic and prove who they were. And, our ability to limit them would be constrained. And, one of the issues at the time with Broadridge's platform is all the submissions were anonymous. So it was difficult to police for shareholders not to submit more than one question. So we talked to the directors. How did you want to handle this? How do you want to handle the questions? They're not used to getting very many. If we had one question at a meeting, that was huge. If we had 2, it was like, oh my gosh, wow, these people are chatty. And we were anticipating we would be much more than that. And it was. We had 9 substantive questions submitted. So for us, that was a 9-fold increase from usual. And the CEO was like, we're going to answer every question. We're not going, you can, filter them in the sense of combining questions or summarizing them. But he said, I want our shareholders to feel heard. I want them to feel like we are taking them seriously, even in this virtual environment. And I want them to believe that we are here to, answer their questions and to be available to them as we would if we were live. And that really made a big difference. And we even, Mr. Chevedden was one of our proponents, and we were able, through looking at the IP addresses, to see he submitted quite a number of questions. And we had the benefit that, many of our peers had already gone, and we had learned the hard way from their experiences that Mr. Chevedden was quite vocal about how his questions were handled in meetings. And so we just dealt with them all, including the question, which was, how many questions did you get? And we just did it. And I think that helped to set the tone, and to create what felt like a more friendly meeting, and engagement with our shareholders, particularly compared to our normal.
Brilliant. No, that's great. Thank you. Just to kind of stick with you, Rosemary, I've seen that there's an audience question come in that sort of relates to that. So can you expand a little bit in terms of how you effectively managed and facilitated that participation? So how do you police those questions when you can't see someone walking up to the microphone and tell them that, that's your question, sit down? I'm really curious just to get a little bit more flavor and any advice you have in terms of making sure, as you said, was a priority to make sure that all of those shareholders are sort of heard.
I think it's evolving, and definitely, as Edith mentioned, Broadridge has been very open about getting feedback on improvements on their platform, and I think we'll see a significant number of improvements on their Q&A submission process. And we had to make some calls. Were we going to allow people to submit questions in advance of the meeting? Were we going to open the telephone lines so that people could verbally ask their questions? Were we going to commit to answering all the questions, or were we going to post questions that were not answered after the meeting? And there was a number of things that we had to make decisions. We chose to try and stick as close to the format of what our physical meeting and a typical meeting for AIG would be. So we did not permit submission of questions in advance. The questions had to be submitted during the meeting. What we decided to do in an effort to, make sure it was a seamless process, we treated it very similarly to the way we do our earnings calls, in that I looked at the questions, and then I would direct the question based on a predefined. We'd said, okay, the CEO will handle these topics, the chair will handle these topics. We had other directors and management available if need be. And so I would, go through the questions. My team was working furiously behind the scenes. We sorted them, by topic, tried to group similar ones together. And so we treated it a little bit like a fireside chat. So, I would say, okay, Mr. Dupro, we have a question, blah, 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 and he would answer it. And then, the team would, take it out of the queue, and we would get to the next one. And so it was really a team effort that made it look seamless, to the outside, but there was we were very much pedaling underneath to keep it all together. But I think that's what helped make that rapport, is because we answered every question that we got. It only extended our meeting by 15 minutes. But for us, that was double our normal length of our meeting. Typical was 16 minutes, and we broke records at 28 minutes for this meeting. But I think that made a big difference.
Brilliant. No, that's great. Thank you. And another top tip there around the process is, make sure that you've got a plan dependent on who is going to answer what category of question, so that, again, it's looking smooth, it's looking like you're in control and professional, and you're getting the right sort of answers to your shareholders as well. Edith, just to bring you in, you've been sat there really patiently. Anything to add in terms of how you facilitate that participation? Are there any horror stories around, committing to sort of answering audience questions, and yeah, just some of your thoughts in terms of how you can build rapport and build that trust with your shareholders virtually.
Yeah, so we went through a similar analysis as Rosemary, but we did accept questions beforehand. We also had published our rules of conduct, so we limited the number of questions to 2, and then we did commit to, publishing any unanswered. But the questions were fielded by our investor relations person and shareholder services, and they aggregated some of the questions, right? If there were questions that were very similar, those were aggregated, and we did, answer all questions. I think maybe the gentleman that you were referring to, Rosemary, about how many people are on the call, I think that is the one exception. We did not answer that question. But because we're a utility and we've been around so long, some of the shareholders we have been shareholders for decades, and some of them are former employees. So when we've had the in-person meetings, there's a group that reliably, show up and have questions. So of course, all of them were on the call, and then we've always had a large group of employees who show up for the meeting. But we did see an increase in the number of shareholders by about a dozen or so, and then a huge increase by as far as the number of employees who dialed in. So we did see an increase, but one of the comments that you just made, I sat in on a webcast that included the gentleman from Broadridge, and a comment he made I thought was very interesting is that there was a client of theirs who did not put a limit on the number of questions that could be submitted by a shareholder, and had committed to publish answers to all unanswered questions. And there was a shareholder who submitted an excessive number of questions, and sort of they painted themselves into a corner because they had obligated themselves to responding to those. And I found that interesting, but we didn't experience that, fortunately.
And Edith, you're absolutely right. And I would tell you, we did publish the rules of conduct. We had them up on the screen as part of the meeting. And we did have a limit of 2 per shareholder, so that we had kind of in our back pocket the ability to police the process and ensure it didn't get out of hand. The challenge was that then Broadridge really didn't give you the optionality to be able to see who was submitting, so it was hard to police, that you could only submit 2 because you didn't know who submitted what. But I think that is critical, and definitely something that I would recommend to others to do, is to maintain your rules of conduct as you do in a physical meeting, so you don't end up in that situation.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. I was going to say, we had it when I did an annual meeting in 2019, and that is something that I'll carry forward, because it is really expectation setting.
That's great. Courtney, can I stay with you actually? I'm kind of interested to build this on into how you prepared for the meeting. So did you find that you saved a lot of time in terms of the logistics of the event? But what was different in comparison to a physical event? What are the different tasks that are associated with holding a virtual AGM?
It was definitely a lot more legwork internally to get ready and to learn the portal, and to work with the board chair to make sure that he understood the portal as well. It was a lot more prep meetings, getting set up, and the technology issue, as Rosemary said, is no joke. And so that you've really got to be prepared and prepped. But in my experience at my last company, which is healthcare, we would never have anyone attend the annual meeting in person. So, we got a lot more participation when it was virtual. And I think that was actually great, and the board liked it. We didn't get questions, but we were only going to do it on the platform and during the time of the meeting. And we did have code of conduct rules out there around it, nothing that we had to enforce, but really just the preparation was more significant than if we had an in-person meeting.
Brilliant, that's great. So again, a couple of themes that are just coming out, make sure that you've got that code of conduct and that you're really communicating that to your shareholders. And yeah, don't overcommit, otherwise it's going to be a long time answering questions that you sort of committed to as well. Just to come back to yourself, Edith, as well, in terms of those extra tasks, or in terms of your preparation, what was different this time, sort of looking at things virtually?
Well, again, the rehearsals, right? All of the rehearsals of getting everyone comfortable with the technology that we were using, and because it really we pivoted overnight, as did everyone else at that time. Literally overnight, we were all working from home. Fortunately, we have an amazing IT group, and so we had already been looking at the Teams platform, and we had already, rolled out a little bit of training on the Teams platform. And my office and the board and the C-suite were the first on the list to start getting the training. So we had already started that training, prior to this overnight pivot. But the technology and the support from our IT group, and getting everyone comfortable, and testing the equipment. We didn't have all the redundancy plans in place that Rosemary had, but we definitely walked through. We had the board member, we do have a couple of board members who are technically challenged, in which it took several meetings, one-to-one meetings with that board member and IT and my assistant to walk them through, because they wanted to use the computer and the iPad at the same time, and you can't do that because of the feedback. And just getting everyone comfortable and prepared, and lots of rehearsals, and now everyone's a pro at it.
Absolutely, yeah. We're all used to sort of checking the lightings almost as much as a sort of Hollywood film studio these days as well. So all of those little points. Rosemary, do you have anything to add in terms of what you found was really different this year in terms of your preparation?
No, we definitely had to do more work on the Q&A preparation. We anticipated we would have more questions because there'd be greater access to shareholder proponents, including non-traditional shareholders that were able to access the meeting that might not have otherwise been experienced at attending annual meetings. And so a lot of work went into trying to think of everything that we could put together so that our director and CEO would be prepared for whatever might come up from an employee shareholder or an institutional shareholder or an activist shareholder. You just don't know where they're going to come from and what they might ask. So that took a lot more work than in previous sessions, because we just knew there would be more exposure. We had to deal with we had a shareholder proponent. We had to figure out, so not only did we have to deal with our technology challenges and concerns, we had to figure out what this proponent would be able to do and how to accommodate them. And, there was a question: do you just offer them a pre-recorded, statement option and have them submit it? Do you allow them to speak live? If they speak live, you're putting a lot of trust that they're going to stick to the script, because it's a lot harder to cut them off in a platform you don't control. We had to figure out, how anyone who wanted to ask a question during the shareholder proponent's, time, on stage, so to speak, how do you do that in a virtual environment with only submissions of questions? So, those were things that logistically we had to really think through, I think, differently and maybe more robustly than we would have typically done. We had to figure out how non-participating members of management and directors could be on and available, but there were limited speaker lines. And so, we had to try and develop cues with the operator on how they could unmute these additional participants if we were going to need them, and making sure they were available and ready. So it wasn't like they were sitting in the audience and I could just point to them. You know, we had to kind of work around additional logistics. So those were some of the things that were, I think, more complicated than usual for our typical meetings. But overall, I think it just made us do, I think we were more thorough in our preparations.
That's such a great point as well. You know, it's not just your technology and your ability to access and run things, but if one of your goals is to be as open and as inclusive as possible, you've got to bring those barriers down for your shareholders who are numerous as well. So that's a really interesting point. I'd actually quite like to shift, you know, that's a really good moment to focus on those shareholders. And I know that you mentioned that there was an increase in terms of attendance this year, particularly for that live section. But yeah, I'm really curious to hear from all of you if you have a sense of the breakdown of attendees. You know, how many were institutional investors? We've seen big rise of interest in terms of retail investors and their activities since the pandemic, and yeah, employees, trade groups, media, that sort of thing. So Courtney, if I can kind of come to you first, how was the makeup of your audience different, and how did you include them?
It was more institutional investors and a good number of employee shareholders. Was sort of how it was different from years prior when it was in person versus virtual. But, you know, we still had way more participation in the virtual meeting than we ever did in person. So I think for some companies, that's a benefit.
Great. And Edith, would that be similar sort of situation for yourself in terms of having an increase in employees, or a particular type of stakeholder group? And did that change anything in terms of how you ran the events or how you dealt with the virtual AGM?
Well, our experience was, you know, just the traditional participants, the employees and shareholders, although in an increased number. But I was very concerned that this might provide a platform for the institutional shareholders. So we definitely discussed, you know, how to manage that if we did have institutional shareholders participate, and that's the main reason we included investor relations, right? Because that's his relationship and he's the one who speaks with them on a regular basis. However, we didn't have that participation. And when we had spoke to Broadridge and asked if what they had been seeing, they said that they really hadn't seen an increase in institutional participation. And fortunately, that's how it played out for us. But we did discuss it, and we were prepared to address it had we had some institutional shareholders participate.
Okay. And Rosemary, was it a similar situation for yourself? And just to build on that, did you have any sort of proposals that you had to sort of manage and deal with, and any shareholder resolutions that needed to be presented as well?
We just had the one shareholder proponent he's a very prolific proponent, and, you know, he's not typically very receptive to engaging with companies in the process. And we had, you know, we found him to be very, you know, willing to work with us. We gave him his options. He, you know, had a strong preference that he wanted to be able to speak live and in person, so to speak, you know, even in a virtual world. And, you know, we worked with him to make sure he had the technology capability and the operator knew who he was so that we could put him in queue. And we had to do a lot of rehearsals as to when would he be able to speak, and then make sure that he couldn't, you know, he didn't have a mic later in the meeting. But it all worked out, but it took a lot of logistical planning.
Fantastic. And then Edith or Courtney, either of you, did either of you have any sort of shareholder resolutions that needed to be presented during your events?
I did not, although I know many companies that did and had a similar proponent to Rosemarie. And I think this year was the year of the pivot for everybody in terms of, you know, a little more collaboration and compassion.
Excellent. That's great, Edith.
And no, we did not have a shareholder proposal to contend with planning for, fortunately.
Great. No, that's no problem. I think that was probably a really good time to look forward. So, you know, we've come out, we've got our battle wounds and our medals. You know, we've gone through that first experience. But what I think would be interesting, particularly for everyone listening in, is how we move forward on this. So I'm curious, in a perfect world, let's say that there's a vaccine tomorrow and we all go back to normal, whatever that might be. Would you, an open question, and Edith, if I can start with you first, would you now be comfortable holding a virtual AGM in the future? I mean, obviously there's regulations aside, but how do you feel about the way forward for virtual AGMs?
Well, of course, I wouldn't be the one ultimately, you know, making that decision, but I would definitely be a proponent. And even in the absence of, you know, the emergency order from the governor of New Jersey, we could do hybrid. And so I would hope that that's something we would think about. And we had a great experience. Like I said, we did the special shareholder meeting in October, and you know, we could have, you know, just done the hybrid, and we opted to, because the emergency order was extended, to do the 100% virtual because we felt comfortable with it and we've had a good experience. And you know, it's hard to say where the future will take us, but I would think at a minimum we may go forward with the hybrid.
Great. Courtney, same question. More virtual, back to physical, stay with hybrid? What are your feelings?
You know, as much as I would love to see the perfect environment occur, I think we're not even close. And so for sanity and planning sake, and just to make sure that the new board is completely prepared, I think virtual is going to be the way to go in 2021. And I think shareholders and the proxy advisory services are getting more used to it and not seeing it so much as a negative, as, you know, a possible way for people to participate more, or, you know, maybe use some more innovative meeting techniques, put more materials out there, do videos, or add something to an annual meeting that wouldn't have occurred in person. But, you know, just the familiarity now that people have, I think will help going into 2021.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That sort of brings us full circle right back to the beginning, where it's kind of like, okay, it's the world is still a little bit uncertain. So it's good to kind of have that certainty for your shareholders, and then you can plan, and then you can prepare and move forward and look at how you can improve things as well. So we'll come back to you in a minute in terms of any ideas that you've got around that. But Rosemarie, just quickly from yourselves, looking at more hybrid options, sticking with virtual, physical, how are you feeling?
Yeah, we just announced that we're not returning back to our offices, at least in New York, until at least April 1st, which will be after our proxy filing date. So we're going to be in 2020 all over again. It's going to feel like Groundhog Day. We're going to have to make another call. I think that if we have the ability to do physical meetings, that's our preference, and that's the preference of our directors, to be able to physically engage with our shareholder base. But if we can't do that, then we will go virtual. But I don't see immediately on our horizon that we would do a hybrid option. It would be one or the other.
Excellent, that's great. And just on that general topic as well, we have had an audience question come in, which is talking about, you know, if you did have your crystal ball to hand, you know, how will virtual meetings change governance in general after the pandemic? So as you look ahead, how's virtual meetings going to change governance? And back to yourself, Rosemary, if that's possible.
You know, I don't know that I see a lot of governance changes in the sense that, you know, other than in states like New Jersey, New York, and others where they had to now permit this virtual option, which was not otherwise available, I definitely see that there's going to be a pivot in those states and pressure on them to potentially codify these executive orders that, you know, up until now, you know, had to enable this on an exception basis. But otherwise, I do think that many of the same issues that we've always had will continue to remain, which is how do you engage with shareholders? How do you do it in a way that is fair and unbiased, but not overwhelming, and doesn't feed the gadflies and not give, you know, others the opportunity to speak? How do you make sure that you are accessible to your shareholders and that at least once a year they feel heard and listened to by the directors and by management? I think all of that stays the same, whether we're virtual or in person. It's just, you know, how do we go about doing that in a transparent way?
So the fundamentals remain the same, but it's just a different sort of delivery method, I guess, to summarize. Fantastic. So we have had another audience question come in, and it sort of relates to something that I was planning to ask in terms of how you would do things differently during your next AGM, your next virtual AGM, if that's something that you are planning to do. So I guess in general, what lessons have you learned, and what are some of the innovative ways of improving that virtual experience? How are you going to go one better next time? How are you going to really improve things for yourselves and for your stakeholders? Courtney, over to yourself, because I know you mentioned that before.
Yeah, and I just continue to look at what others have done this year as ways to reach out and to continue to have transparency and, you know, videos posted on the website, additional materials that are up for shareholders to see, and just more openness and disclosure in the proxy, I think, is where people will net out a little bit.
Brilliant. And same question to you, Edith. How are you going to go one better this year?
I'm not sure, because, you know, we've had great experience twice this year, and, you know, we've tried to be transparent with the shareholders, offer them the opportunity to you know, submit their questions, and we've been responsive to them, and we haven't received any negative feedback from our shareholders regarding that. So I think it's working, but again, you know, I think Rosemary's right. Next year we might be in Groundhog Day and doing 100% virtual, and whether we would continue hybrid, or whether New Jersey will codify the exemption from the permission to do the 100% virtual, are all remain to be seen.
Brilliant. Rosemary, finally to you, same question. Have you had any ideas, anything overall that you want to do, that you want to achieve next year to go one step ahead? And potentially also, just to build on that, anything you would warn me off if I was to do my first virtual AGM? What are some of the potential pitfalls that you could fall into, and some of the mistakes that we don't want to make last year? What have you learned?
Wow, that was a lot. So the first thing I would say is, in terms of things I would do different or better, it's really dependent on how the available platforms evolve. I would be very interested, especially now that my directors are used to WebEx and video meetings. I'd love to do video for our next shareholder meeting if I don't need to dispatch camera crews, you know, all over the hinterlands. to facilitate that. I do think that, virtual environments are going to lead to more robust Q&A. So again, if the platforms, allow having better management of the Q&A so that we can enforce the rules of conduct and make sure that we are getting a fair representation of questions from all of our shareholders, that would be helpful. But so some of it is I'm dependent, right, on the tools and the availability to do things differently. So those are things I think we've done that we're thinking about that, and we've given the feedback to our technology partners to see if we can enable that. In terms of if we have to do this next year, rehearse. Redundancy, we already, I'm pretty, much a stickler. So we have runs of show down to, the minute for our physical meetings. We have the same thing for our virtual meeting. And, trying out the platforms with and without directors, looking at all of the redundancy for technology, ensuring that you are still paying attention to those governance items, right? Making sure your rules of conduct are posted, making sure that your shareholder lists are available, and are, adhering to the corporate legal requirements so that you have a valid annual meeting. You have to it's a little bit like, walking and chewing gum at the same time. You've got to do everything that you did before, and you now have to juggle the technology on top of that. And so just remembering that this is an event that takes a village. We've heard from all of our panelists, they're relying on colleagues in IR and shareholder services and IT and on our vendor partners. And you have to know that you can't do this as an island and be successful.
Great. And can you actually, just as you mentioned around the technology piece and working with those vendors, can you elaborate on that slightly? So how have you sort of worked with technology providers to make sure you have that smooth delivery of a virtual AGM? And what sort of feedback are you providing to whomever your technology provider is? What will be on your wish list in terms of what they can do and the capabilities of technologies if virtual AGMs are going to increase?
Like I said, the provider we used has been extremely receptive to feedback. I mean, we have to see if the feedback actually manifests into upgrades to the technology. But we had an immediate session with them following our meeting. We've had meetings with them as part of industry peer groups. We've also done that with large cap peer groups. So we've tried to, anytime there was an opportunity to get in front of the vendor with a wish list, we were there. We made sure we've been quite vocal. The things that I would like is better, Q&A management, better ability for me to manage the questions with my team, to queue them, to sort them, to prioritize them, to better identify who has submitted what so that we can track and make sure we know who's asking the questions, and enforcing our rules of conduct. We've asked for the video enablement without the need for a camera crew. iPad cameras work great. Really would like to be able just to do that because it's not practical, especially in a remote world, to be able to dispatch crews everywhere in a socially distant environment. So those are some of the things that we've been asking for. And I'm optimistic that at least one or more of those will make themselves into the next version.
Brilliant, that's great. And that's a great sort of place to end it as well. Before we do go, I just want to get one final word from you in terms of just to summarize, what we should focus on when it comes to virtual AGMs. What's your final message? Edith, if I can come to you, then Courtney, then Rosemary, just really succinct. What should we think about going into virtual AGMs in the future?
The most important tip I can give is being comfortable with the technology and make sure that everyone involved is comfortable with the technology, and also pulling in the various departments, because as Rosemary said, you're not an island on this. You have to pull resources from all over the company to make it happen. And just, rehearse, test, and it all should go well. Fingers
Fantastic.
crossed, right?
Absolutely. Courtney, over to you.
Yeah, no, I echo that, Edith. And the redundancy backups are key as well. And just making sure that the board and management and all of the internal and external people that are working on this are aligned, and, everybody's communicating frequently.
Brilliant. And then
Yeah, so Steve, the last thing I would say is leverage this community. One of the terrific things about the corporate governance community is we are all about helping each other be mutually successful. And so, learning from others, being willing to see what their lessons learned were, going and checking out the ones that go before you, seeing what worked, what didn't work for them, and being able to adapt and be willing to share that with the community, I think is the other key to success.